Welcome to Paying Attention with Nicholas Gruen. This is a show where we take you beneath the surface of public affairs, economics and government using nothing more than our secret superpower, paying attention. I'm your host, Matt Jones. We've spoken about how in policy, competition and cooperation are not polar opposites. Instead, they are entangled. We illustrated this idea of entanglement with sport. Put simply, we won't get much of a competition going if we can't agree on the rules of that competition. In sport, that means that there has to be a pretty solid agreement on the rules of the game before there can be much competition. We explained how that idea of entanglement of competition and cooperation is often a better way to think about them rather than thinking of them as polar opposites. So competition isn't better than cooperation, or vice versa. Each is a part of and helps to define the other. Nicholas Gruen thinks that the same can be said for most aspects of our social and economic lives. In this video, we'll show how general that idea is by showing how it applies to a simple conversation.
In a conversation, two people participate with their own objectives and their own interests. They might want different things from the conversation. One might want to learn something or pass the time. The other might want to project an image of themselves as clever and knowledgeable. In other words, both want something for themselves. In that sense, they're there in their private capacity, pursuing their own goals. In that sense, they're competing. But together, they are both working on a joint project. Another way of thinking about competition versus cooperation is to talk about the private and the shared. So the participants in a conversation are private individuals, but they're sharing the project of the conversation. Each may get somewhat different things out of it, but if it's to be of value to them, it needs to be a shared production.
We've all had good conversations and we've had bad ones. So what distinguishes the good conversation from the bad? And what lessons can we take from them? Nicholas?
This is where we get to see how if an individual wants to get something for themselves from an interaction with others, they have to cooperate with them for that interaction to work properly. Here, the sporting analogy works well. A conversation between two people will be as good as it can be, when its participants both agree about the terms of the conversation, or the rules of the conversation, if you like. Rules like listen to one another, respond to one another's points, don't interrupt, take turns. Of course, they don't agree explicitly, but by the time they're in middle school, most of us tacitly adhere to these terms of a conversation. And these are minimum standards. Our adherence to them is a form of cooperation that's widely understood in our culture and so can be improvised between participants. And the rules of conversation are not just tacit, they're interpreted according to a spirit, which means that they can be varied as the conversation evolves. Subtle interruptions often help steer the conversation where the participants want it to go. So it's like an improvised game in a schoolyard. It might begin with two kids throwing a ball to each other, but then develop so that each throws the ball to make it difficult for the other to catch, with the other demonstrating their prowess in catching it. Here the players compete to show off their skills, but they can't do it without the cooperation of the other. If one of the players throws the ball onto the roof, it's impossible to catch, and so the competition ends because cooperation has broken down. Just like the game, good conversations follow their own emerging spirit.
And if these are lessons from good conversations, bad ones illustrate the same principles. And bad conversations have been getting worse in our culture.
In sport, the spirit of a game helps guide the players and the way the rules are interpreted. But in most professional sports, the rules are clear enough. So players offending the spirit of the game usually break its rules as well. And anyway, there's an umpire there to enforce the rules. But in a normal conversation, each participant isn't just a player. They also share the umpiring function with the other person. Both participants share the burden for ensuring some sense of fair play so the conversation can be worthwhile. They'll use subtle cues, nodding, frowning, jumping in and encouraging or objecting, to establish and reinforce the rules of the conversation as it unfolds. But if that doesn't work, if someone just keeps interrupting or shouting or ignoring the other's points, the other might just walk off and the conversation stops. In very special conversations, we also have umpires. So in a presidential debate, the moderator is a kind of umpire. But even here, it's not entirely like a sport. That's because the terms on which a conversation is held are subtle and improvised. It's impossible to pin them down in explicit rules. And in a presidential debate, the two debaters are usually not trying to produce a shared conversation that generates insight into the issues and their disagreement. They're trying to advantage their agenda any way they can to make themselves look better at the cost of their opponent. So the quality of the conversation is very low, and we don't learn much other than the debater's well-rehearsed talking points. Something has happened to change the nature of presidential debates since they were brought into the television age. If you watch the TV debates between Richard Nixon and John F. Kennedy in the 1960 presidential campaign, they're amazingly informative about the different candidates' policies and where and why they disagree. As the competition has intensified between candidates to get elected and broadcasters seeking ratings, competition has leaked into the terms on which the debate takes place. And as we've been saying, if participants don't cooperate on the terms of their debate, the debate itself is degraded. Politicians have discovered that they can be more effective by being less informative. Instead of giving specific and informative answers to questions, they'll rehearse talking points that have been carefully tested in focus groups to sound good but say little. Even the moderators will focus on snappy, gotcha questions rather than cultivate an informative discussion. Emotions are good for ratings. Information is not. Presidential debates are conversations in which competition and cooperation are entangled, but in an increasingly unhealthy way. Remember, in a high-quality interaction, whether it's in sport or conversation, competition is usually a good thing if both parties play fair and both ensure that the terms of the competition serve their shared project. As Monty Python's argument sketch shows, competing in a conversation doesn't make sense unless the conversation is grounded in cooperation. In a good debate, the participants compete, but around shared objectives to test their understanding against each other, to persuade the other, and perhaps to learn something by exploring different views. The point couldn't be more timely, because our world is descending into conversations in which everyone's trying to tip the terms of those conversations to their own advantage. There's a tendency that's been growing for decades as more and more effort goes into spinning messages for the public, not just from politicians, but from an army of advertisers, marketers, and those pumping out communications and PR on behalf of all their organisations in the public, private, and not-for-profit sectors. And as if that wasn't enough, we now find the dysfunctional nonsense world of the Monty Python argument sketch recreated endlessly every day on a social media site near you. And that's a subject we'll take further in another video.